The delivery driver noticed alarming signs at an elderly woman's home, then made a life-saving 911 call. He not only saved her life, but also brought hope to the community, proving that in critical moments, care and decisiveness can make a significant difference. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Evan Porter had always liked the quiet hours of the morning. The small California town of Parkview, nestled among low-rolling hills, seemed to stretch and yawn as dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and orange. It was peaceful, and that was how Evan liked it. His job as a delivery driver wasn't glamorous, but it suited him just fine. Each day he felt part of something bigger, a web of connections between people in the community. He slid into his delivery van, the familiar leather seat fitting him like a glove. As he drove through the slowly waking town, he enjoyed the silence, only broken by the soft hum of his engine. Parkview had been his home his whole life, and though his routine rarely changed, it felt like comfort rather than monotony. Evan turned onto Sunset Avenue, a tree-lined street with quaint houses, each with its own well-tended yard. This was one of his favorite streets. Many of the residents greeted him by name, like Mrs. Hawthorne with her pet beagle, and the Logan family whose two young boys loved to wave enthusiastically whenever he passed. One stop Evan particularly looked forward to was at 235 Sunset Avenue, Hannah Fisher's home. An elderly woman with a quick wit and an easy smile, Hannah had become one of Evan's favorite people along his route. Every holiday, she'd surprise him with a homemade cookie or a small loaf of pumpkin bread. On slower days, she'd invite him to her porch for a brief chat, sharing stories of her life and sometimes asking him questions about his. To Evan, Hannah was like an anchor in his day, a reminder of the small-town warmth and connection that made Parkview feel like home. Today, however, was a typical day. Evan followed his usual routine, stopping at the houses he knew by heart, delivering packages, and exchanging a few greetings with early risers. As he approached Hannah's home, he spotted her distinctive flower pots lining the path to her door, filled with vibrant blooms she tended carefully each season. The sight brought a slight smile to his face. He parked the van, grabbed a small package addressed to Hannah, and headed to her door. He was just beginning to imagine the cheerful exchange that would follow when his mind briefly wandered to their previous conversations. He remembered her warm laugh and the way she'd pat his hand, like he was part of her extended family. Evan reached her front door and knocked gently, expecting her warm, "Good morning, Evan," to follow. But there was only silence. He knocked again, a little louder this time, but still no response. He checked his watch. Maybe she was still sleeping in. But that wasn't like her. She was an early riser, often up before he arrived. Frowning slightly, Evan decided to leave the package on her porch and continue his route, reminding himself that everyone was entitled to a late morning now and then. But something unsettled him. Maybe it was the quiet that seemed to hang heavier than usual, or the way her porch light was still on, even though the sun had fully risen. He shook off the thought, heading back to his van, but he found himself glancing back at her house one more time before he drove away. As he finished his route that morning, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Hannah was part of his routine, one of those small constants that made his days feel grounded. And today that constant had shifted, leaving an odd sense of incompleteness behind. For now, he would brush it off as a one-time thing. But he couldn't help but feel that he'd be looking for her on his route tomorrow, hoping that warm, "Good morning, Evan," would greet him once again. The following morning, Evan felt an unexpected anticipation as he turned onto Sunset Avenue. He realized he was looking forward to seeing Hannah Fisher again, almost as if seeing her would confirm that everything was still in its place. The feeling from the previous day, that slight unease, lingered in his mind, even though he had tried to brush it off. As Evan neared Hannah's house, his attention was immediately drawn to her front yard. Something looked different. Hannah usually kept her small garden neat and well-trimmed, but today he could see weeds poking through the soil, the grass looking slightly overgrown. It was subtle, but it was enough to make him pause. He parked his van by the curb and stepped out, package in hand. As he walked toward the door, his eyes fell on another small but odd detail, a stack of newspapers on her porch. He counted them. 3 papers, all untouched, their edges slightly yellowed from exposure to the sun. Hannah was usually prompt in collecting her newspaper each morning. She'd sometimes even read headlines out loud to him, sharing her thoughts on the local events and amusing anecdotes. Evan knocked on the door, then waited, listening for any sound inside. But there was nothing. He tried again, a little louder this time, shifting from one foot to the other as he glanced around the yard, noticing the flower pots starting to droop, the soil in them dry. His sense of unease grew as the seconds stretched out into silence. "Maybe she's just out for the day," he muttered to himself, but the words felt empty, as if he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Just then, Evan heard the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. He turned to see Oliver Grant, one of Hannah's neighbors, walking up to his own front yard next door. Oliver was an elderly man with a wiry frame, known around Sunset Avenue for his meticulously cared-for rose bushes. He was usually out each morning tending to them, but today he seemed a bit distracted, his brow furrowed as he glanced over at Evan. "Morning, Evan," Oliver greeted him, setting down his watering can and wiping his hands on his jeans. "Haven't seen you stopping by Hannah's place this time of day in a while." Evan nodded, his brows knitting together. "Morning, Oliver. Actually, I was just wondering if you'd seen her lately. She wasn't home yesterday either, and her papers are starting to pile up here. Doesn't feel like her." Oliver's face mirrored Evan's concern, his frown deepening. "Come to think of it, I haven't seen her in a while. Used to see her out here almost every day, puttering around her yard or sitting on her porch. But it's been quiet. Too quiet, actually. I thought maybe she went to visit her family or friends, but I suppose that's not like her either. Hannah doesn't go far without letting someone know." Evan felt a slight knot form in his stomach. "Did she mention any trips or anything to you recently?" Oliver shook his head. "No, not a word. We chatted last week about her garden plans for spring, and she seemed just fine then. I didn't think anything was out of the ordinary." Evan glanced back at the door, then at the stack of papers, his mind racing with possibilities. He could feel a strange mixture of worry and uncertainty settling over him, and as much as he wanted to convince himself that Hannah was fine, something inside him wouldn't let it go. "I'm sure it's nothing," he said finally, though his voice sounded unconvincing even to himself. "Maybe she's visiting someone or just laying low. But thanks, Oliver." Oliver gave a reassuring nod, though his face was still marked with concern. "You know, Evan, Hannah's a tough one. If she needed help, I'd like to think she'd reach out. But sometimes folks like her, living alone, they tend to keep things to themselves." Evan nodded, hearing the truth in Oliver's words. "Yeah, you're probably right. Thanks for letting me know, though." As Evan turned to leave, he cast one last glance at the quiet house behind him. For the rest of his route, he found himself unable to shake the image of her empty porch, the untouched papers, the overgrown grass. There was something there, a lingering sense that things weren't as they should be. Even though he wanted to respect her privacy, a persistent worry had taken root in his mind. It was a small town, and in a small town, people looked out for one another. Maybe he was overthinking things, or maybe he wasn't. Over the next few days, Evan couldn't help but feel his eyes drifting toward Hannah's house each time he turned onto Sunset Avenue. His route was otherwise routine, his deliveries running smoothly, but whenever he approached her property, that same uneasy feeling crept back in. Something wasn't right, and it seemed to be only getting worse. On Tuesday morning, as he pulled up to her house, the sight that greeted him made his heart sink. Her mailbox was stuffed full, the edges of some envelopes sticking out, damp and wrinkled from days of exposure. For Hannah, who was normally so meticulous about checking her mail, this was beyond unusual. He lingered there for a moment, debating what to do. He wanted to respect her privacy, but the mounting signs made it harder to ignore. What if she was in trouble? What if something had happened, and he was the only one noticing? These questions lingered as he walked up to her door again and knocked, more out of habit than expectation. Just as he thought, the only response was silence. Evan decided he couldn't just leave it at that. Perhaps someone in the neighborhood knew something more. Maybe Hannah had told someone where she'd gone, and he could put his mind at ease. After a few hesitant knocks on doors nearby, he finally found himself standing at the front counter of Parkview Market, where he'd often seen Hannah chatting with other residents. As he scanned the small store, his eyes fell on Marge Tillman, a retired teacher who was close to Hannah's age. Marge was often seen at the market, catching up on gossip and trading recipes with other locals. Evan approached her, hoping for a casual conversation that might reveal more. "Morning, Marge," he greeted her with a polite nod. "Why, if it isn't our favorite delivery man," Marge responded with a smile, adjusting her thick-rimmed glasses. "What brings you here this early?" Evan chuckled, though his mind was still focused on Hannah. "Actually, I was wondering if you've seen Hannah Fisher lately. Haven't run into her the past few days, and her place seems, well, a little neglected. Mail piling up, newspapers gathering on the porch." Marge's smile faded slightly, and her brow creased. "Hannah? Now that you mention it, no, I haven't seen her around." She paused, her expression thoughtful. "She usually comes here every month for the old classmates' meetup. Just last month, she was telling us all about how she planned to redo her flower beds for spring. I was expecting to see her again, but she didn't show up last weekend." The word struck a nerve. Evan had hoped Marge would assure him that Hannah had simply gone off on a short trip or maybe to visit family, but it seemed Hannah had vanished from her regular spots without telling anyone. "Did she mention anything to you? Maybe something about a trip or some family visiting?" he asked, a slight edge of urgency slipping into his voice. Marge shook her head, a flicker of worry crossing her face. "No, nothing like that. In fact, she seemed quite excited about getting her garden ready for summer. It doesn't sound like her to just leave without telling anyone." Evan's mind raced as he tried to piece everything together: the neglected yard, the uncollected mail, the absence at her regular meetups. Every small detail stacked up, making it harder to ignore the nagging sense that something was wrong. Seeing the concern on his face, Marge reached out, resting a hand on his arm. "Evan, Hannah's a proud woman. She wouldn't want to trouble anyone if something was wrong. But if you feel like there's something more going on, maybe you should look into it. Sometimes people keep to themselves when they really need help the most." Evan nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He knew Marge was right. As much as he respected Hannah's privacy, he couldn't shake the thought that if something had happened to her, someone needed to step in. He had seen too many elderly residents in Parkview, living alone and too proud to ask for help, fall through the cracks. He thanked Marge for her time and walked back to his van, feeling an odd mixture of determination and doubt. It was a strange line to walk, between respecting someone's boundaries and ensuring they were safe. But every instinct he had told him that something wasn't right, and that if he didn't act, he might end up regretting it. As he drove away, Evan made up his mind. He would come back to Hannah's house once more the following day, and if things still seemed off, he would have to make a decision. He only hoped he wasn't too late. The next morning, Evan's mind was already made up as he pulled onto Sunset Avenue. He knew he couldn't ignore his growing concerns any longer. Today he'd make sure he had answers, one way or another. The early morning fog lingered low over the street, giving the neighborhood an eerie stillness that only heightened his unease. Evan's stomach tightened as he pulled up to Hannah's house. The yard looked even more overgrown than before, and the stack of newspapers on her porch had increased to nearly a week's worth. He noticed a faint odor hanging in the air, something stale and unsettling that set his nerves on edge. Swallowing hard, he approached the door, trying to steady his breathing. He knocked firmly, counting the seconds as he waited. "Mrs. Fisher?" he called, his voice carrying through the quiet morning air. There was no answer, no sound from inside. He tried again, knocking louder, the silence stretching out around him. His hand hovered over the doorbell, pressing it repeatedly, as if willing her to answer. When nothing happened, Evan stepped back, feeling a mixture of frustration and dread. His mind raced through the options. She could be out, but all the signs suggested otherwise. And if she was inside? He didn't want to think about the possibilities, but each second that passed made him more certain he couldn't leave without knowing for sure. A few houses down, he noticed Oliver, who was just stepping out to water his rose bushes. Oliver looked up, noticing Evan's troubled expression, and approached, his brow creased with concern. "Any luck?" Oliver asked, glancing at the house. The worry in his voice mirrored Evan's own. Evan shook his head. "Nothing. I've knocked and called out, but there's no response. It just doesn't sit right with me, especially with the way things look around here." Oliver nodded, his gaze moving from the house to Evan, understanding dawning on his face. I think you're right to be concerned. Sometimes you have to trust your gut. Evan took a steadying breath and pulled out his phone, his fingers hesitating over the numbers. Calling emergency services felt drastic, but in that moment, he realized he couldn't live with himself if he walked away and something had happened to Hannah. With resolve, he dialed 911, explaining the situation in a calm but urgent tone to the dispatcher on the other end. His heart pounded as he described the piled-up mail, the overgrown yard, and the fact that no one had seen or heard from Hannah in days. The dispatcher assured him that help was on the way, and all he could do now was wait. Within minutes, the distant sound of sirens broke the heavy silence on Sunset Avenue. Evan's heart raced as he watched a police car and an ambulance turn onto the street, their flashing lights casting a surreal glow over the quiet neighborhood. He stepped back, feeling a mix of relief and trepidation as two officers and a pair of paramedics exited their vehicles and approached him. "Are you the one who called this in?" the taller officer asked, his voice professional but kind. Evan nodded, feeling a rush of nerves as he explained the situation once again, recounting every detail that had concerned him. The officers listened carefully, glancing occasionally at the house, their expressions growing more serious with each passing moment. "Thank you for letting us know," one officer said. "We'll perform a welfare check, but we'll need you to stay here for now." Evan nodded, stepping back and watching as the officers moved toward Hannah's door. They knocked loudly, announcing themselves as police, their voices firm yet cautious. The silence that followed was deafening, heightening the tension as they exchanged glances and tried again, banging harder, their knocks echoing across the empty street. After several long moments, one officer stepped back, gesturing for his partner. They conferred briefly, then positioned themselves to force entry, a decision that made Evan's stomach drop. He held his breath as they braced themselves, and with a swift, powerful motion, broke the door open. The sound of splintering wood sent a chill down his spine as they disappeared inside, their flashlights cutting through the dim interior. The paramedics stood nearby, medical bags at the ready, waiting for any sign that they were needed. Evan found himself rooted to the spot, the seconds stretching out agonizingly as he strained to catch any sound from within. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. Had he overreacted? Was Hannah really inside? Or worse, was he too late? Suddenly, a voice called out from inside the house. "We need medical assistance here, now!" The paramedics sprang into action, grabbing their equipment and rushing through the open door. Evan's heart pounded as he watched them disappear inside, the reality of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. He felt a cold sweat break out as he tried to process everything happening around him, his mind flashing back to his memories of Hannah, her warm smile, her laugh, her kind words during his visits. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, one of the officers re-emerged, his expression grim but calm as he approached Evan. "Sir, it looks like you did the right thing calling us," the officer said, his tone gentle. "We found Miss Fisher inside. She's alive, but in very poor condition. The paramedics are stabilizing her now, but she'll need to be taken to the hospital immediately. It seems she's been unwell for some time." Evan felt his knees go weak, a wave of relief and guilt crashing over him. Relief that she was alive, but guilt that he hadn't acted sooner. He nodded, struggling to find words, his throat tight with emotion. As he watched the paramedics wheel Hannah out on a stretcher, his breath caught in his throat. She looked frail, her skin pale and her frame thinner than he remembered. Her eyes were closed, and an oxygen mask covered her face, lending an unsettling sense of fragility to the woman who had always seemed so full of life. He turned to the officer, his voice barely a whisper. Will she be okay?" The officer placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "The paramedics will do everything they can. You helped by noticing and calling us. Without that, she might not have made it." Evan nodded, his gaze following the stretcher as the paramedics carefully loaded it into the ambulance. He felt a strange mixture of sadness, guilt, and resolve. Seeing Hannah in such a vulnerable state made him realize just how fragile life could be, and how the small actions of others could make a world of difference. As the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing into the distance, Evan stood on the empty street, the weight of the morning settling over him. He'd done what he could, and now all he could do was wait, hoping that Hannah would recover and that he'd get the chance to see her smile again. Evan didn't waste a moment before heading to St. Joseph's Hospital, the same hospital where the ambulance had taken Hannah. His mind raced with questions, a mix of guilt and fear clawing at him. Every memory of her, from the little bags of cookies she'd hand him on Christmas to her laughter filling her porch on warm afternoons, came flooding back. The thought of her lying frail and unresponsive made his heart ache. The hospital lobby was a flurry of activity. Nurses and doctors moved in well-practiced rhythms, faces set in serious expressions, as Evan approached the front desk. He cleared his throat, feeling a nervous edge creep into his voice as he asked, "Excuse me, I'm here to see Hannah Fisher. She was just brought in. I'm not family, but I found her and—" The receptionist glanced at him sympathetically and nodded, typing something into her computer. "You're listed as the one who called in the emergency," she said. "Give me just a moment." Evan took a deep breath, steadying himself as he waited. The minutes stretched, each second heavier than the last, until finally, a doctor in scrubs approached him. She looked calm but serious, her expression one of practiced empathy. "Mr. Porter," she asked, looking over a clipboard, "I'm Dr. Whitney. I understand you're the one who brought Miss Fisher's situation to our attention?" Evan nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, ma'am. Is she going to be okay?" The doctor gestured for him to sit in a nearby chair, and he followed her lead, settling into the stiff hospital seat. She took a seat beside him, a clear indication that the news she had wasn't simple. "She's stable for now, but she's in a fragile state," Dr. Whitney began gently. "Miss Fisher is severely dehydrated and malnourished, and it appears she's been this way for some time. We're also aware of her ongoing cancer treatment, which, unfortunately, has likely contributed to her condition. Without proper care, her health declined much faster than it would have otherwise." The words hit Evan like a blow. Cancer. He'd had no idea. Hannah had always seemed so lively, so full of energy. She never mentioned a thing, and now he understood why. She was the kind of person who kept her struggles to herself, never wanting to burden anyone. But knowing this only deepened the guilt he felt. I didn't know she was sick," Evan managed, feeling his voice falter. "She never said anything." Dr. Whitney nodded understandingly. "It's not uncommon. Many elderly patients, especially those without close family, try to manage things on their own. Sometimes they're too proud or too afraid of being seen as a burden. We see it often, unfortunately. People fall through the cracks." Evan's stomach twisted at the thought. "So, she's been going through all of this by herself?" The doctor sighed, a hint of frustration in her expression. "It appears so. From what we gathered, she'd been discharged from her previous hospital visits with recommendations for home care, but it doesn't seem that any consistent support was put in place. Her situation is, sadly, not uncommon. Hospitals are often overcrowded, and resources for elderly patients living alone can be scarce." Evan clenched his hands, feeling a surge of anger and helplessness. There has to be a better way. It's not right for someone to go through this alone. Dr. Whitney's expression softened. "You're right. But by calling for help when you did, you gave her a fighting chance. Without intervention, her condition would have been much worse. You may very well have saved her life." Evan absorbed her words, a small sense of relief mixing with the guilt and sadness that weighed on him. "Can I see her?" he asked finally, a quiet urgency in his voice. The doctor hesitated, glancing at her clipboard. "She's sedated right now, so she won't be able to speak. But I think it might do her good to have a familiar face nearby. Follow me." Evan followed Dr. Whitney through the winding corridors, his heart pounding with every step. When they reached Hannah's room, he took a deep breath, steeling himself as the doctor opened the door. The room was dim, lit only by a sliver of daylight through the closed blinds. Machines beeped softly, their lights casting faint glows over the still figure in the bed. Hannah lay on the hospital bed, her face pale and her frail body covered in a thin hospital blanket. Tubes connected her to various machines, an oxygen mask covering her mouth and nose. She looked so different from the vibrant woman he remembered, her features drawn and fragile, as if life itself was hanging on by a thread. Evan approached her bed slowly, feeling the overwhelming weight of the situation settle over him. He gently took her hand, careful not to disturb any of the medical equipment. Her hand felt cool in his, her skin papery and thin. A wave of emotion washed over him as he looked at her, the full reality of her struggle sinking in. "I'm so sorry, Hannah," he whispered, his voice choked. "I should have known. I should have done something sooner." He stood there, lost in his thoughts, his guilt mixing with a fierce determination. He had always thought he was just the delivery guy, a friendly face on her porch a few times a week. But now, he realized that maybe he was more. Maybe his role in her life, as small as it seemed, had a deeper significance. Just then, the door opened quietly, and a nurse entered to check on Hannah. She offered Evan a sympathetic smile. "She's in good hands now," the nurse assured him. "We'll take care of her, but I think it means a lot that you're here." Evan nodded, still holding Hannah's hand. "She shouldn't have to go through this alone. I'll make sure she doesn't." As he left the hospital that day, a sense of resolve settled over him. He wouldn't let Hannah fall through the cracks again, not while he could help it. He'd find a way to ensure she had the support she needed, even if it meant reaching out to the community or finding services she could rely on. Hannah had spent too long managing on her own, but she wouldn't have to do that anymore. Evan was going to make sure of it. Evan returned to St. Joseph's the next morning, anxious to know if there had been any change in Hannah's condition. The hospital, as usual, bustled with activity, but this time, it felt different. There was a sense of purpose in his steps, a new clarity that drove him forward. Hannah wasn't just another person on his route. She was someone who mattered, someone who deserved more than to be forgotten and left behind. When he reached the front desk, he asked about Hannah, and a nurse recognized him from the previous day. "Good timing," she said with a kind smile. "Miss Fisher regained consciousness this morning. She's a bit groggy, but I think she'd like to see you." Evan felt a wave of relief. Following the nurse down the hall, he steadied himself, gathering his thoughts, hoping his visit would bring her some comfort. Outside her door, he paused, taking a deep breath before gently knocking and stepping inside. The room was quiet, save for the gentle hum of machines and the soft beeping of the monitor beside her bed. Hannah lay propped up against the pillows, looking frail but awake. Her eyes, though tired, held a flicker of recognition as she saw Evan enter. A small, weak smile spread across her face. "Well, if it isn't my favorite delivery man," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but laced with a hint of her familiar warmth. "You didn't have to come all the way out here for little old me." Evan managed a smile as he pulled a chair close to her bed. "I think I did, actually," he replied softly, feeling the tension ease just a bit. "You had us all worried, Hannah." Hannah sighed, her gaze drifting toward the window. "I'm sorry, Evan. I didn't mean for anyone to worry. It's just, well, I thought I could handle it on my own." She looked back at him, a touch of sadness in her eyes. "Guess I was wrong." Evan hesitated, unsure how much to ask, but knowing that he needed to understand. "Why didn't you tell anyone, or reach out? You've got people who care about you, Hannah. You shouldn't have to go through this by yourself." Hannah closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, laced with a vulnerability Evan hadn't heard before. I thought it was my burden to bear. I didn't want to trouble anyone. My husband, Harold, he passed years ago, and we never had kids. I always prided myself on being independent. I thought I could manage, until I couldn't." Evan's heart ached as he listened. He could hear the strain in her voice, the pride that had kept her from asking for help, and the loneliness she'd shouldered in silence. "You don't have to do it alone, though. You've got neighbors, friends. You've got me." Hannah chuckled softly, the sound tinged with both warmth and regret. "You know, I've always loved this neighborhood, the people, the community. It's what kept me going all these years. But sometimes pride gets in the way. I didn't want anyone to see me like this, weak and needing help." Evan reached out, gently holding her hand. "You're not weak, Hannah. You're one of the strongest people I know. Asking for help doesn't make you weak. It just means you're human." She looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, Evan. You're kind to say that. I never wanted to be a burden. The cancer, the treatments, they take so much out of you. I tried to keep up, but eventually it was just too much. I kept telling myself that if I just pushed through, I'd get better. Evan swallowed, feeling the weight of her words. Didn't the hospital send anyone to check on you? I mean, they knew you were living alone, right? Hannah nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. They suggested home care, but my insurance barely covered the treatments as it was. I couldn't afford regular visits. I thought I could handle it by myself, maybe stretch my savings, make it last, but her voice trailed off and she sighed heavily. I should have known better. There are so many people out there worse off than me. I thought I could be strong enough. The truth of her situation hit Evan harder than he'd expected. The system had let her down, and Hannah's own pride had done the rest. It wasn't right. No one should have to make the choice between their pride and their health. You know, Hannah, everyone in the neighborhood looks up to you, he said softly, hoping to bring some light to her. You're not just a part of their day. You're family. And family looks out for each other. You've given so much to everyone around you. It's okay to let us give a little back. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she gave his hand a gentle squeeze. Thank you, Evan. I don't know what I would have done without you. You and Oliver and everyone else. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Evan knew then what he had to do. He couldn't just walk away, not after everything she'd been through. She needed help, real help, and he was determined to make sure she got it. You just focus on getting better, he told her, his voice filled with quiet determination. When you're ready, we'll make sure you're taken care of. The whole neighborhood will. You won't have to do any of this alone. Hannah nodded, a small but genuine smile breaking through the sadness. For the first time in a long time, she felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lighten, the burden no longer hers alone to bear. Leaving the hospital that day, Evan's thoughts turned immediately to action. He knew that Hannah's struggle wasn't unique. There were others in the community, often living alone, who might be facing similar challenges in silence. If he could help, even just by organizing support, he felt it was his duty to do so. Back in Parkview, Evan's first stop was Sunset Community Center, a cozy, low-slung building that often hosted local meetings and small events. He'd seen posters there for groups like the Sunset Senior Support Society, and he hoped someone from the group could help him gather support for Hannah. Inside, Evan approached the front desk, where he was greeted by Sarah Lawson, a volunteer coordinator he recognized from previous community events. Sarah, a warm-hearted woman in her early 30s, was known for her dedication to the town's elderly residents, often coordinating food drives and check-ins for those who lived alone. Evan, good to see you. What brings you by? Sarah asked, smiling warmly. Evan took a breath, knowing he'd need her support to make this work. Actually, Sarah, I was hoping you could help me with something important. You know Hannah Fisher, right? She's on my delivery route. Sarah's smile faded slightly, replaced by concern. Oh yes, Hannah, lovely woman. I heard she hasn't been doing well lately. Is there anything I can do? Evan nodded, his determination firm. She's at St. Joseph's now, recovering, but she's going to need a lot more help when she's back home. I know she doesn't have any family close by, and I thought maybe we could set up some sort of support network for her. Not just temporary care, but something more long-term. Sarah's face brightened with understanding, and she nodded, clearly moved by his words. That's a wonderful idea, Evan. I think we can do something. In fact, I can reach out to some folks from the support society and arrange a meeting. Let's get everyone on board. Feeling a surge of gratitude, Evan agreed. Within a couple of days, Sarah had rallied the neighborhood, inviting a small but dedicated group of residents to discuss ways they could support Hannah. They gathered in the community center's meeting room, and Evan was struck by the turnout. People of all ages, from retired couples to young families, had shown up, each wanting to help. Evan stood before them, feeling a mix of nerves and purpose. Thank you all for coming. As some of you know, Hannah Fisher has been going through a hard time, dealing with health issues on her own. She's given so much to this neighborhood, and I think it's time we gave something back. He looked around the room, gauging their reactions. He saw nods of agreement, concern etched on their faces. The atmosphere was one of shared empathy and a strong desire to support one of their own. One woman, Mrs. Carter, raised her hand. Evan, My husband and I would be more than happy to prepare meals for her each week. We could take turns with some others here, make sure she has fresh, healthy food ready when she needs it. Evan smiled, feeling hope grow. That would be amazing. I think if we all pitched in, even with small things, it could make a big difference, Sarah chimed in. We can also set up a rotating schedule for check-ins. I'll coordinate with some of the volunteers here to make sure someone visits Hannah at least every other day, just to keep her company and help with whatever she might need. An elderly man, Oliver Grant, the same neighbor who'd spoken to Evan about Hannah's absence earlier, raised his hand next. I could take care of her yard work, he offered. She's always kept it so nice, and I know it matters to her. I'd be honored to help with that. The sense of solidarity in the room was palpable, and Evan felt a swell of gratitude and pride for his neighbors. It was a simple but powerful thing, watching his community come together. They talked for over an hour, organizing shifts, collecting donations, and putting together a list of volunteers who would be ready to assist Hannah however she might need. Sarah, ever practical, made sure everything was documented, setting up a shared calendar with names and times so that every task was accounted for. We'll make sure she's got everything she needs, from groceries to companionship, she said with a smile. As the meeting wrapped up, Evan felt a lightness he hadn't felt in days. For the first time, he was confident that Hannah wouldn't have to face her struggles alone. But he knew this was only the beginning. The next step was finding a way to cover her medical expenses and support her recovery more directly. Afterward, Sarah pulled Evan aside, her expression thoughtful. You know, Evan, I've seen other communities set up online fundraisers for people in situations like Hannah's. It's amazing how quickly people come together when they see someone in need. Evan's eyes lit up. That's a great idea, Sarah. I'm not exactly tech savvy, but if you could help set it up, I'd be more than willing to get the word out. Leave it to me, Sarah replied, already pulling out her phone. We'll have it live by tomorrow, and once we spread the word, I'm sure we'll get the support we need. True to her word, Sarah had the fundraiser live by the next day. Evan shared the link with everyone in his network, friends, family, co-workers, even local businesses who knew Hannah and valued her as a member of the community. Within days, donations began pouring in, each contribution a testament to the impact Hannah had on those around her. As the funds grew and the schedule for visits solidified, Evan felt a profound sense of fulfillment. What had started as a simple concern had grown into something bigger than he'd ever imagined, a community rallying together to care for one of their own. For the first time in days, Evan felt a genuine sense of hope. He knew that when Hannah returned home, she would no longer face her challenges alone. They'd all be there with her, each person ready to lend a hand, a smile, or a kind word. She was part of their community, and together they would see her through. A few weeks after her hospitalization, the day finally arrived for Hannah to return home. Her recovery at St. Joseph's had gone well, thanks in large part to the collective efforts of her neighbors, who had made sure she had everything she needed, both in the hospital and back home. Evan had visited her frequently, bringing updates on the neighborhood and the plans they had all set in motion. On the day of her return, the small house on Sunset Avenue looked better than it had in years. Volunteers from the community had spent the morning sprucing up her front yard, trimming the hedges, weeding the flower beds, and planting fresh blooms in the pots on her porch. Oliver had made it a personal project, showing up with his gardening tools and tending to the yard with care, determined to keep it looking the way he knew Hannah loved. Inside, neighbors had tidied the house, ensuring that her homecoming would be as comfortable as possible. Fresh linens were placed on her bed. The kitchen was stocked with groceries, and bouquets of wildflowers, gathered from the nearby park, adorned the living room, filling the house with a gentle, welcoming fragrance. As the small neighborhood gathered outside, Evan stood by the walkway, his heart swelling with pride and anticipation. Sarah and a few others had organized a small welcome home gathering, a simple but heartfelt gesture to show Hannah how much she meant to all of them. A few minutes later, the van from St. Joseph's pulled up, and the entire neighborhood fell silent, watching as the driver helped Hannah out and onto the porch. She looked frail, but was smiling, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of her neighbors, all gathered to welcome her home. A mix of gratitude and emotion washed over her face as she took in the scene, the freshly planted flowers, the tidy lawn, the smiling faces of people she'd come to know as family. "Welcome home, Hannah," someone called out, and the crowd joined in, cheering and clapping, their voices warm and welcoming. Hannah's eyes filled with tears as she looked around at each familiar face. She steadied herself on Evan's arm, who was standing close by, his own smile reflecting the joy of everyone present. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. I don't even know what to say. This is more than I could have ever imagined." Evan gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You don't have to say anything, Hannah. This is your home, and we're all here to make sure it stays that way. We're just glad you're back with us." Sarah stepped forward with a basket of home-cooked meals that Mrs. Carter and a few others had prepared, ensuring Hannah wouldn't have to worry about cooking for at least a week. "These are for you, Hannah," Sarah said, her smile warm and genuine. "And if you ever need anything, just let us know. We're here for you." One by one, neighbors approached, each offering a kind word, a small gift, or simply a warm smile. Some offered to take turns visiting her in the evenings, ensuring she had company, while others promised to take her to her doctor's appointments. Every offer was sincere, and Hannah felt the weight of her previous isolation lift, replaced by the comforting knowledge that she was no longer alone. As the afternoon wore on, people drifted back to their homes, leaving only Evan and Sarah. Hannah invited them inside, insisting they stay for a cup of tea. As they sat in her cozy kitchen, Hannah glanced around, a look of peace settling over her. "You know," she began, her voice soft, "I never realized how much I'd miss this. Just having people around. I always thought I could manage on my own, but now I see that I was wrong. I didn't need to be so stubborn." Evan smiled, nodding. "Sometimes we all need a little reminder that it's okay to lean on others. We're stronger together." Hannah looked at him, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you, Evan, for everything. If it weren't for you, I don't know where I'd be right now." "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his tone sincere. "This is what community is about. Besides," he added with a grin, "who else is going to give me cookies every Christmas?" They laughed, the sound filling the small kitchen, a reminder of the warmth and connection that had been missing for so long. As they sipped their tea, a comfortable silence fell over them, each of them reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the quiet streets of Parkview, Hannah watched from her window, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The loneliness that had once weighed heavily on her was gone, replaced by the unwavering support of the people around her. She knew now that she would never face her battles alone again. For Evan, that evening marked a turning point. He realized that his small actions, checking on a neighbor, making a call, rallying the community, had made a lasting difference in someone's life. And as he walked home, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that he'd done his part in helping to build a stronger, more compassionate community. The town of Parkview had always been a place of simple routines and familiar faces, but now it had become something much more, a community united, bound by kindness, and strengthened by the shared understanding that no one would ever be left behind. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.